we're going to go straight to the phone lines, where we understand that standing by is Professor James Small. Professor Small, are you there?
Yes, ma'am. I'm here.
Thank you so much for your patience. Very happy to have you online.
My pleasure.
You know, I just talked about conspiracy theories because, you know, it happened last week and it was just about to happen again this week, and I would have none of it. So we're very happy that we have you on as we go in search of our God and looking specifically at African spiritual systems and the ancient Kemetan mystery system, the Egyptian mystery system. But I want to start, Professor Small, by looking at spirituality and religion, because this is something that you've spent a lot of time on teaching, and African spirituality in particular. Let us start there.
Well, we have to make sure we're clear what spirituality is. And to me, from what I've learned through studying different African scholars and just training myself in Africa, spirituality is a person's understanding of, comprehension of, and fully involved in their reality. You know, in Africa, when we talk about spirituality, we are talking about the African's relationship to the rest of nature and his involvement in that relationship and his understanding of that relationship. And then when we talk about religion, you know, religion isn't an opposite of spirituality. It is a tool of spirituality. But religion involves your belief in something, your rituals, your ceremonies. And you create rituals and ceremonies as teaching tools, to teach concepts, ideas, and principles that are too vast to write down in a book. And those are the concepts and ideas about your relationship to the rest of nature and the cosmos.
And just before we get to...
And that's what we're talking about.
Right. And when we say African spirituality, is that narrowing this down, constricting it, putting it in a box, or does it help even those of us who are among our community who are going through psychic trauma?
It doesn't narrow it down. It actually defines it. The Africans have a worldview, have a way of looking at the rest of the world that is peculiar to Africans. And that worldview arises out of the African understanding of his own beingness and the relationship and the interrelationship of that being to the rest of nature. You know? What is our relationship to plants? What is our relationship to animals? What is our relationship to the air we breathe? What is our relationship to the light energy that comes from the stars and all of the other planets that bombard us every day? Right now, you and I, we're on a radio by telephone with no wires. So this sound is passing through the air. But it's real. And so the Africans understood that a thought could pass through the air. That energy from a bumblebee, that energy from an herb, an energy from a tree, energy from the water is constantly interacting with each other, including us. Now, how do you understand the kind of interaction you need to have with the rest of the energy that emanates from the rest of the things in nature? And how do you determine what is healing? How do you determine what is harmful? You know, you build a relationship. That relationship, which should be called sacred science, is what we call African spirituality.
And to go back to the point you made that religion is a tool of spirituality. Religion is used as a tool to interpret spirituality to oneself. How then do we factor in the different kinds of religion that we see now, Islam, Christianity, and so on, bearing African spirituality in mind?
Well, what has happened, people have now confused the tool with the thing. You see, we operate with the tool and forgetting why the tool was created. And so the tool doesn't work unless you know its purpose and its intent. And so religion now has become rituals, but the rituals is not explaining what the metaphor is. For instance, if we take the story of Jesus Christ, we can go back in history, and every society have a Savior that is crucified in some form or another, and that is risen. Every society, from Mesoamerican, if you read the book, The Papal Vu, which is from Peru, which is pre-Columbia, they have a story of a virgin mother birth and a child that becomes God. If you go back to ancient Egypt, they have a set, the virgin mother, who have the child Kheru, who is born of Immaculate Conception. And then you have Osar, who is crucified and then is risen again. These features are in every society. Now, what happens is when the people take the metaphor that is used to explain the concept and idea and principle and think the metaphor is reality. And we get lost. What is the principle of the metaphor? All human beings is that Immaculate Conception. All human beings. All human beings have the potential of being what we call the divine. In the Ewe language of Africa, the Ewe are people who live in Togo, and they live in the Volta region of Ghana, which borders onto Togo. And their word for God is Sobe Lisa, that God is the totality of creation itself, and that all things that exist as an expression of an aspect of that divineness. And God is not a person in any African context. God is beyond knowability. No one knows God, because to know something, you have to be able to define it and name it. And so you can't define and name something unless you know its boundaries. And if God had boundaries, it would not be omnipotent, omnipresent, omnipotent, and supreme. But what the Africans do understand is that God is the totality of everything, including us. And so we are mere expressions of aspect of the divine essence having the human experience.
This is where I was going, because I know this is something that I heard you say, and the moment I heard that, it affected me at many levels, positively of course, that I saw things totally differently, because it was said so simply. And you always did feel that one of the things you said is Africans, black people, that we are the first manifestation of God in human flesh.
The first manifestation as human. From that thing which we call God, the totality of everything. When it defined and manifests itself as human, it manifests itself as a black woman. And all other human beings, and even today's contemporary science has proven it to be so, emanates from the womb of the black woman, who emanates from the psyche of the divine itself.
So what are we to make of Adam and Eve?
It's a metaphor. The word Adam simply means earth in Hebrew. You see? And so Eve is the life force that comes up out of earth. It's a metaphor about nature and the cosmos. And if you just look at the language, it's incredible. You know, Dr. Ben told us that a mystery exists only because you don't know it.
Yeah.
Once you know a thing, it's not a mystery anymore. And the thing that we are calling a mystery is our basic understanding of nature itself. Human beings are made up of over 400 elements. You know,
so that without controversy, which is what my father always said to me back in the day when we would question things, without controversy, great is a mystery of godliness. So that it's a mystery to those who did not understand and those who wrote that. But one of the things you've said, Professor Small, is that, to go back to Christianity and Islam and so on, you point to the fact that these tools of spirituality evolved out of the understanding of spirituality, that they're fragments from the periphery of African spiritual systems. Can you explain that for us?
And we have now confused the tools with spirituality. Religion is not spirituality. It's the tools. You know, if I want to tell the story of redemption, and then I can take the story of a Jacob and I can write it on a few pages and explain when his brothers, who sells him into slavery out of envy, you know, at a point they will redeem themselves when the father Jacob sent them in search of the brother. Because when you commit a crime against your own psyche, in order to be spiritually healthy, you must go through a period of redemption. We see the same thing even if we went to the Yoruba religion. We have people take our African spiritual system and the religious tools we create, and we've limited them to religion. And so we see people talk about the Yoruba religion, but there is no Yoruba religion. There is Ifa, which in Yoruba means the wisdom of nature. And there's Orisha, which in Yoruba means the forces in nature. So what we do is work with the wisdom of nature to guide us on how to use Orisha, the forces in nature. But if you confuse Shango with being a human being, you've lost your way. Shango is the courage within any human being to go through dynamic change, or at least to develop the courage to move towards dynamic change for the better. And in that metaphor of Shango, Shango marries Oya. Oya is the wind. The wind represents change in process. So the courage to change, which we call Shango in the Yoruba system, marries change in process, which we call Oya in the Yoruba system. And then Oya, the female, practiced polyandry. She will now marry Ogun, the god of iron and the god of war, because Ogun represents transformation as a result of change. So the courage to change must marry in the human psyche change in process. Change in process, having gone through the process, must marry transformation in order to cause a dynamic growth in the human spiritual development. But if we don't understand the philosophical, the metaphorical reason for doing these things, we just do rituals for the sake of ritual.
I want to come back to that after we go to a quick break. Professor, can you hold the line for me, please?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, we take a quick break. We'll be right back. Interesting conversation with Professor James Small. Right back.
Speak truth to the people. To identify the enemy is to free the mind. Free the mind of the people. Speak to the mind of the people. Speak truth.
All right, we're back with you inside of the Africa Forum. It is Running African in Search of Our God. Our series continues. African spiritual systems, becoming God again, raising ourselves up again with knowledge of ourselves, quoting directly there from Professor James Smalls. We're doing this one step at a time. Professor Small, before we continue, why is it important, or do you think it is, to for African people to participate in this this kind of experience, whether it's a physical search or a mental search of our African spirituality or our God?
It is important to be healthy and to be spiritually healthy. You must also be physiologically healthy. You must be psychologically healthy. You must be intellectually healthy. You know, spirituality is the resulting effect of all of these things. And so, for African people who are living in a world as an organism, let me go back and step on a couple of things so that the rest of what I say makes sense. You and I are the sum total of millions of our ancestors, our mother and our father, in depositing a sperm and an egg. They deposited themselves as you and as me, not in you. That sperm and egg that came together, that formed you, was the totality of your mother and father's DNA. Mm-hmm. Do you understand?
Yes.
And if we go backwards in time, you will end up to the divinity itself. The very DNA that makes you up emanates from what we call God in the beginning. That's the only place you can end up if you go backwards. Mm-hmm. So we are God's DNA being expressed in its totality. You contain everything of your mother and your father, who contained everything of the 4 people, your grandparents, who contained everything of the 8 people, your great-grandparents, who contained everything of the 16, your 16 great-great-grandparents, and everything of the 32 great-great-great-great-grandparents, and back. So you are the sum total of all of your ancestors' experiences, memories, feelings, ideas. Everything is embodied in those things we call your DNA. Mm-hmm. That is you. And then now you, with your experience with nature, is building on that and adding to that in terms of its experience in time and space. Mm-hmm. If you understand that, then you'll understand the importance of knowing history. That you must know the history and the cultural experience of the people out of which you come. Mm-hmm. Because that very history and those cultural rituals and dance and music and drumming and so forth brings out of your DNA the memory of past lives. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense to you?
It really does make a lot of sense, and so that if one doesn't know that ancestry, if you have been so brutally cut off from yourself, from your people, the DNA, that process you took us through, then who are you?
Then you are the product, the mind of your oppressors. And then we end up in our situation that we're in poverty, being oppressed by a minority. Look at Jamaica. The European who colonized us, enslaved us, is a minority, but they still control our Jamaica. Mm-hmm. Look at us in America. We are nearly 80 million strong, brilliant African peoples that has come from all over the world now. And we are still being oppressed by a people whose culture have not produced anything significant in time and space, because we are cut off. Our umbilical cord to our ancestral past have been cut. And the only way to restore that umbilical connection to our spiritual Godhead is to study and learn the history and experiences of the DNA that make up our bodies.
Professor, I don't
know how better to put
it's
things.
Well said. It is well said, and actually does a lot to help us to lay the groundwork to continue these series, which we're getting a lot of pushback on from from various sections of a society. Now, I want to go forward. We were talking about tools of spirituality and religion as a tool of spirituality just now. Part of being cut off from ourselves in the way that we have as a result of slavery and colonialism and neocolonialism is obviously Christianity, religion, and what that has done to us as a people. So help us to understand the concept of God and the origin of the concept of God. Is this a Eurocentric concept? Is it a white man's concept?
No. Yeah. Even what we call Christianity, though we did not call it that, is an African formulation that Europeans took and have recast in their cultural ignorance and gave it back to us. And we are confused because we are trying to see reality through the eyes of our murderers and our rapists. And you won't be able to see your reality. You'll only be able to see their reality. And if you see yourself through their reality, you see yourself as a victim to be preyed upon by them. And so you become your own predator. You become your own predator. And so until we understand that, we're in trouble. Christianity, before it was called Christianity, had its birth in Africa. It was an explanation in a more modern time than ancient Egypt of the same laws of nature that ancient Egypt was trying to explain to ourselves. And so if you go to Ethiopia now, one of the 5 oldest churches in the world sits in Ethiopia. It's called the Church of Miriam. And in that church, no women is allowed in that church because a sister, I think her name was Beatrice, burnt all the churches down when they were first built in Ethiopia. That one did not burn all the way. They saved that one. In that church is a 6th century painting of the Madonna and Child. I've seen it with my own eyes. The Madonna is black and wearing a beautiful blue gown with gold trim. The child is black, wearing a beautiful white gown with gold trim. This is the classic Madonna and Child. Remember, Michelangelo don't paint the Madonna and Child we know in Christendom until the 15th century. So then explain to me why we got black paintings from the 6th century in Ethiopia. Guess what? Martin Luther isn't born yet. The Reformation hasn't happened yet. Guess what? The Catholic Church is not born yet. So whose religion is it? The problem with it is when you create a teaching tool, and that's what religion is. It's a teaching tool in your culture to keep you connected spiritually. And someone else takes that teaching tool and recasts it in their culture, and you try to use it to explain your culture, you're going to be in a mass of confusion.
So that Africans practice Christianity, and you have always been at pains to underscore Christianity and Islam before. We
practice what they call Christianity before they called it Christianity. Because we didn't call it Christianity.
So that
it's just our way of life.
Right, and you mentioned
so
Ethiopian.
What they did, they took the rituals that we were using to teach ourselves spiritual concepts, and they made those rituals historical happenings, and they weren't, and they wove them in, they wove the metaphor in with history. This all happened at a time in history we all know. 325 A.D., the Emperor of Rome, Constantine, called for a conference, and at that conference they began the process of producing the religion we now know as Christianity, using its tenets and its rules from the fragments of what they have of the African spiritual system. What he wanted, the Roman Empire had conquered North Africa by this time, conquered most of them, all of the Mediterranean basin, and it needed a way to control the population that it had conquered. So it took control of that spiritual system using the Roman army, and Constantine says this, that he will use the Roman army to enforce this new point of view, this new what became a religious point of view. Even the Pope before Francis, when he visited Cameroon in 2009, told the Cameroonian people of West Africa that out of the 10 authors of the document we call the Bible, 7 were Africans. This is what the Pope said. And we all know this anyway. I mean, Dr. Bella taught us these things, and we've learned them through our own research. But if African people truly understand that what we are looking at when we are looking at religion, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, we are looking at our enemies' adaptation of fragments from the periphery of our spiritual understanding, using our pieces of our metaphor to create a religious philosophy that is enforced and backed by state military, even to today.
We're going to take another quick break. Before we do that, one question, and then we come from that break. We speak in the next half an hour that we have on the Egyptian mystery system. But I wanted to put in perspective the Coptic Church, Ethiopian Orthodox, and some of the Islamic traditions out of ancient Ghana.
Yes.
How are we to view those?
Well, if we go to the Coptic Church, remember there was a church called the Byzantine. This is the first manifestation of Christianity that comes out of that writing of Constantine. The Coptic Church of Ethiopia. There's another Coptic church. There's the Coptic Church of Egypt, which breaks away from Constantine and go and establish itself. What Constantine first creates becomes what is called the Byzantine Church. Out of the Byzantine Church arises the Ethiopian Church. But Ethiopia begins to interpret it differently because it has all the tenets of its own ancient history. After the fall of the Byzantine Empire to the Roman Empire, Ethiopia then comes under the tutelage of the first church, which is called the Coptic Church of Egypt, started by Arius and his followers, who rebelled in 325 AD against Constantine. Of course, this person, Arius, was murdered in Egypt to keep him from establishing a spiritual perspective that would oppose what Rome was establishing. What Rome establishes finally becomes the Catholic Church. And so the Ethiopian Church will find its way back to itself as it breaks with the Byzantine Church, and it comes under the tutelage of the Egyptian Coptic Church until the time of Haile Selassie, before they got full control over their own church. But you remember Egypt, the Egyptian Coptic Church is an African phenomena. And if you go to the Coptic Museum, which is some of the oldest painting that depicts the character that we now call Jesus. Remember, there was no J then, because J don't comes into being until the 16th century as a letter in the English language. So that personage that we now call Christ, and all of the Coptic Museum is painted black. That personage we call Mary is painted black. That personage who is Mary's mother, and you'll see paintings of Mary's mother with her grandson Jesus in the Coptic Church painted black. All of the disciples are painted black. And so when we go back into our history, you'll see we were trying to tell the stories, the metaphorical story of life, using anthropomorphic representations of black human beings.
We're going
to tell a story, you have to use pictures because people are not literate. So how do you tell them this story? You can't write a thesis using script because the masses don't read any script. So you use pictures. You use drawing. That's all hieroglyph is using pictures out of nature that will explain symbolically concepts, ideas, and principles about how to transform yourself into a better human being and how to build right relationship between other human beings and nature in order to create the harmony that will make your environment healthy.
Professor, we're going to take another break, asking you to hold once again for me. When we come from this break, we look briefly at the Egyptian mystery systems. We did say that there's no way we can do this in one sitting, but we're trying. Take a break.
Absolutely.
Online, Professor James Small, as we continue our search for African spiritual systems. We call this series In Search of Our God, African Spiritual Systems, with a subtitle, of course, directly from Professor Small's, Becoming God Again, Raising Ourselves Up Again with Knowledge of Ourselves. Professor Small is on the line as we go into the final segment. Prof, can we look now at the Egyptian mystery system? And you just talked about mystery. So what is so mysterious about the Egyptian mystery system?
What makes it mysterious is when you don't know it. The Egyptian mystery system is the very science of today. There's a book, it's called The History of Mathematics by an author named Mr. Kajari. And in his chapter 1 of his introduction, he quotes Plato. You know Plato?
Yes.
Who they call the great Greek philosopher? And then he quotes Plato from a treaty called the Phaedrus, which is written by Plato, or said to be written by Plato. In the Phaedrus of Plato, Plato says the Africans, but he's using the word Ethiopian, which is a Greek word for burnt face or black face. And so he's saying the Ethiopians have given us all of the world sciences. And then Plato begins to quote arithmetic, geometry, and he says medicine. And he goes on. And he says, but the greatest science of all that these blackface have given us is the science of writing itself. What we are calling the mysteries. It is so funny that you don't get it.
Yes.
The mystery is what you are able to master using the most fantastic tools our ancestors gave us. You know what those tools are?
Yes,
the 7 liberal arts. The 7 liberal arts are the mystery tools of ancient Egypt that is used to bring outside of you what is embedded in you. Everything in nature, everything in the cosmos, everything that we can call the essence of the divine is embedded in you. The very word, English word, education, comes from the word educate, means to bring something inside out. But in order to bring something inside out, you need tools. And so our ancestors created 7 tools, which we today now call, in every university of the world, the 7 liberal arts. An extraordinarily good book for this is called Stolen Legacy by George G.M. James. The Stolen Legacy by George G.M. James.
And that's good because we do have that book on our reading list for the Running African Book Club. I know persons have been reading it. And it makes this discussion even more relevant to them, I'm quite sure. So can we go into that a bit more then? The curriculum of the what's included in the teachings. Can we say the curriculum of the mystery system as George James says?
Yes, ma'am. What he simply shows is that the mystery is within you. All that you are seeking is within the individual. It is embedded in the DNA that is you. But you need tools to bring them out. And that's what music is about. That's what dancing is about. That's what arithmetic is about. That's what geometry is about. See, you must master how to bring outside of you that which is embedded inside of you. And you also use the experiences that you've had and the experiences your ancestors have had, because that helps in the recall. But then you have to understand purpose. And this is even in the Bible. I think it's in Proverbs chapter 9, where it talks about the 7 daughters of wisdom. The 7 daughters of wisdom is those same 7 liberal arts that we created as tools to help the human mind extract from its own inner self the wisdom of nature itself. That's the mystery. That's what I'm a Freemason. I'm a Prince Hall Mason.
Yes.
And we're talking in Masonry. We said we seek to make good men better. You know how we make good men better?
How?
Master the 7 liberal arts and use those tools to bring the essence of the divine within out.
And how does one master the 7 liberal arts?
Study. We do it when we send our children to school. We learn to read.
Yes.
We learn to write. We learn to do arithmetic, to master arithmetic. We learn to master geometry. We learn to sing. We learn music. We learn harmony. We learn dance. We learn rhetoric, how to speak in an appropriate manner to convey thoughts, ideas, and principles through sound. You know, those 7 liberal arts is what they teach us, starting with kindergarten, right through college. But no longer is the emphasis put on mastering the 7 liberal arts. They tried to get you to master what they say, a trade or a tool, but they no longer explain to you that the foundation of your being is those 7 liberal arts created by our ancestors to bring what's inside of you out. And the reason you want to bring it out, you want to use that wisdom that is embedded in you from the first manifestation of the human being, when you came out of the divine itself. You want to use that wisdom to develop a relationship with everything else around you, human beings, animals, plants, cosmos, in order to create what the ancient Egyptians call Maat. Maat is symbolized by a woman holding the scales, which we use now in the West and call the scale of justice. But what Maat means, to create harmony, balance, reciprocity, and how you deal with everything else in nature. And how you deal with your own body, your temple. This is where you live. This is not who you are. And so the ancient Egyptians teach us about the soul, which they call the Ka. They teach us about the soul, which they call the Ba. They teach us about the spirit, which they call the Ka. They teach us about the personality, which they call the Kut. And all of these are the 3 parts of the human being that must be developed in order for the human being to live a physiologically healthy life, a psychologically healthy life, a spiritually healthy life, and to help pass that kind of healthiness on to other life forms that it meets, creating the harmony and balance in nature that is healing and healthy.
And let us talk a little now about the Egyptian theory of salvation, which is what I think you're also just touching on. And the reason for that is, so we do have this violent rejection of anything Egyptian, anything that came out of ancient Kemet. And that especially through modern day Eurocentric Christianity, and especially the more fundamental Christianity.
Right, and it's like that go down Moses to Egypt land, that false story about the Hebrew children. If you go to Egypt even today, it is the best recording of history of any civilizations ever manifesting itself anywhere in the world. And yet there's no mention of Hebrews. There's no mention of a Moses. There's no mention of any of that. How can we have such an incredibly 9,000 to 10,000 years of written history? That one little incident of 400 years, they claim, is not mentioned anywhere in the 9,000 years.
So the logical conclusion to that is what? Somebody
made up the story because it fitted their narrative. It fitted their narrative. And even in their story, in the book of Isaiah, they refer to a king of Egypt and all the world. This is supposed to be coming from the mouth of Isaiah. And this king of Egypt and all the world, according to Isaiah, is named Taharka. And he tells the people of Israel in their Torah reading that this king of Egypt and all the world, Taharka, will save Israel from Assyria. And he's telling the Israelis, don't attack them, don't engage them militarily, because this powerful force is going to save us from the Assyrians, who is at that time in history is the conquering force. And there's another king in that Hebrew narrative. His name, I think, is Shoshank. I think he's mentioned in the book of Kings. And this is another great Pharaoh of Egypt who comes and saves these same people. Now, when you look at the location, because that's why history becomes important now, because when you look at the location, the so-called Middle East or Palestine, and you go back to even their narrative, when their Abraham, according to their metaphor, comes into Jerusalem, which is already there. Jerusalem is not established by any Hebrew tradition. Jerusalem is the name of the Canaanite capital city. The king of the Canaanite tells Abraham he's filthy and he's unclean, and they teaches him circumcision. They circumcise him. So the tradition of circumcision you will find painted on the walls in ancient Egypt 5,000 years before any Hebrew dating begins. So when we study, and the reason I think people they speak against Egypt so heavily, if you begin to study Egypt, you will see the foundation for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. You know, I was a Muslim imam for 18 years. A lot of people don't know. When Malcolm X was assassinated, I'm the guy that took over as the imam at 21 years old.
Yes.
And I went to Mecca in 1975 and made my Hajj. And so I have a good, solid background in that tradition as well. And so when you go back and study ancient Egypt, you know how we make the 5 prayers a day. You will find that certain priests make 5 prayers a day. You know the 3 main positions we go into? The Egyptian prayed in the same 3 main positions. And you know, like we go and make our circuit around our Kaaba.
Yes.
Well, in ancient Egypt, and we call the Kaaba in Mecca Beitul Allah, the house of God. Well, in Egypt, when your Ba and your Ka comes together, it forms the temple of Amun, the house of God. So when we study our tradition, we'll see that these modern traditions are mere fragments from the periphery of our greater ancient traditions, which we find in Egypt. And anyone who's a Freemason know that we may talk about how we come from England, but all of our symbols and all of our temples are Egyptian. Explain that. There's no Egypt in England. So if our Genesis is England, why is all our temples, the design of our temples, the rituals in our temples, the symbols in our temples, is all ancient Egyptian?
Professor,
So this is a thing of coming out of the darkness into the light by studying your history. And once you learn history, you have solved the mystery.
We're going to take another short break, very short break, just for a time signal, and then to look at how we begin this journey towards advancing our own African spiritual development right after this. 17 minutes now after 8 o'clock. You're inside of the Africa Forum. It's Running Africa, and we continue our series in search of our God, African spiritual systems, becoming God again, raising ourselves up again with knowledge of ourselves. Professor, we're going pretty fast, and I know you're always available. This is a conversation that we want to continue with you in the coming year. Thank you so much. The importance You talked about rituals just now, and just before we go into moving forward, the importance of rituals in African spiritual systems, because I think one of the things that, even though we have managed to hold on to it, the importance of rituals in African spiritual systems, because I think one of the things that, even though we have managed to hold on to in various forms in Brazil, in Jamaica, in Cuba, and so on, that we seem to have lost a lot of that. And how have we disconnected, and what part does the lack of rituals in our everyday life play in the disconnection between us and ourselves?
Well, we've lost a lot of it because we fail, because of the crisis that we have been in, the war against our minds by the Europeans during this enslavement and colonial period, and even the post-colonial period, the psychological war to disconnect us from Africa, have left us with only fragments of our system. And so we need to understand better, and the way to do it is to study history. Dr. Wade Nobles have come up with a new book. It's the latest book on this idea of how we regain our minds. And he calls it the Island of Meme, the Unfinished Revolution. And he uses the Haitian Revolution as the metaphor to explain all African revolution. And in the Island of Meme, what he's explaining is that we are making decisions on our lives based on the European idea of what's real, which is rooted in the European experiences that have arrived at this moment. While the European was having an experience, the African was having also an experience. So who am I going to base my life on today, in this moment? Do I base it on the experience of the European, or do I base it on the experience of the African? Well, I have to know what the African experience was in order to have a basis to explain my present reality. Mm-hmm. If I only know the European interpretation of my experience, and I try to explain that as my reality, I will be caught in confusion, because that is not my reality. And so history becomes critical and important. I'll show you one example.
Yes.
The oldest book, religious text in the world, known by any man anywhere, is called the Pyramid Text. Mm-hmm. In the Pyramid Text, you will find the Genesis story that you will see repeated in the Torah, in the Bible, and the Quran. But if you don't know that the African has a text written on the walls of the Pyramid of Unis, I think it was in the 5th and the 6th dynasties, which goes back 4,000 years before the Torah. And you will see that everything that makes up the story of Genesis in our Bible is copied from this text in the African Egyptian tomb. And once you get that understanding, it helps you. You'll even see the 12 disciples, my dear. It'll blow your mind. Mm-hmm. The first 12 powers of God, the original 12 disciples, is there. It tells you how God says, I create myself out of myself. I cause existence to exist so that existing might exist. Mm-hmm. And when I, God, realized that I existed, beside me stood Maat, the feminine principle of harmony, balance, justice, and reciprocity. Mm-hmm. Then God goes on to create everything, from light to darkness to land and to humans. And when he's finished creating all of these things, God says, having created all that my heart desired, I then expanded in it, or in them. Mm-hmm. That's our Genesis story. That's a little synopsis thereof.
And that is
the
not
obia that everybody's afraid of.
Yes, yes.
The truth.
And we haven't even gone there this morning, Professor, to look at voodoo and Obi and so on. And that is why you're really going to have to come back. You really do have to come back. And I think we're going to do that in short order. Our next discussion on this In Search of series will be in January. Hope that you'll be able to join us then.
I'm hoping. Yes. I really do hope so.
Yes. All right.
Because we'll see that our sacred science and our spirituality is the very science of nature. What they're calling physics today, that the Greeks copied from us, is a part of our spirituality. What they call geometry today, that the Greeks copied from us, is our spirituality. You know, it's a part of our spiritual understanding of nature.
How might knowing this, understanding this, and I know we have had a thread of this all morning, but finally, as we wrap up, how might having this knowledge, gaining this knowledge through study, as you encourage us, change our present condition?
Because once you have knowledge of yourself, then you begin to restore your self-value, your self-worth, your self-esteem. And then you can project yourself as a possibility. You can dream differently. You see. You can design the future in your mind differently because you have a different concept of who you are. Mm-hmm. And history is just so beautiful. You know, you've heard about the Haitian Revolution.
Yes.
Did anybody ever tell you that a Jamaican started it?
Of course. We've talked about that a lot in this space.
Some people do know, okay. But to think, one man who is true to his African essence, spark the greatest revolution in the world and defeat the mightiest powers on earth. Even though our revolution was sabotaged and it is not yet complete, Bookman gave us the tools for success. The degree to which we've moved away from what the essence of that prayer of Bookman on that first night is the degree to which we've sabotaged our own freedom.
As a matter of fact, we have that prayer right here, which we'll read at some point this morning. We did plan to do that. Professor Small, finally, there's one thing you said that I want to go out with and want you to just quickly comment on. You said, don't make God something remote that you have to make some secret prayer to. Don't make spirituality something spaced out.
Because God is every and all things at once, including you.
We will leave it
the totality of creation.
We will leave it at that for now. Thank you so much. The social media has been a buzz all morning, literally. To our listeners at IrieFM.net, they have been glued in and clued in on this conversation, also on the 107. So we really want to thank you for assisting us this morning in our search. Professor,
thank you for inviting me.
All right,
thank Jamaica for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Professor James Small.